Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to NASM Live. My name is Prentiss. I'm here with Chris and Kara Mohr from Mohr Results. And today we're going to talk about how COVID-19 has shaped nutrition and exercise habits. Thank you both for joining us today for this webinar. And before we begin, can you tell us just a little bit more about yourselves and your business?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having us. It's great to be here. So our business, our backgrounds are in exercise physiology. Both of us have Ph.D.s in exercise physiology. Then I'm also a dietitian. And we work a lot with corporations and companies and helping them and individuals kind of carve their well-being challenge, whatever that may be, helping with nutrition habits, exercise habits as well.
Yeah, and so my background is in psychology, and then all of my work has really been in taking the principles that we know around exercise, physiology, around getting people to be more active, to change their nutrition habits. How do you actually apply that so that it becomes sustainable, so it becomes lifelong? And that's really been my passion. And so I get all geeked up on how we form new habits and what we do to really support them. So it's fun to be here and to have this conversation today.
Well, thank you for joining us. And why don't we just get started? Because I'm interested to hear, just to learn about your philosophies. I'm going through a lot of what you've written about right now. So why don't we just talk about how has this situation changed us? I know for myself, sometimes it's a struggle to keep up with the regular routine now that everything's changed. So what can you tell us, doctors, what are we going through? How can we manage this time?
Yeah, and so I think it's really cool because right now all of us are in this immersion experience, right? Just a short 10 weeks ago, we were living life very, very differently. And when we normally look at changing behaviors, it's sort of a gradual process because it's hard. We have these behaviors and habits we've been doing for 20, 30 years. And so they've been formed in the routine and we don't even think about them. And yet in this experience, we've had just almost overnight people, drastically doing things different. Now we're washing hands relentlessly all day long for 20 seconds at a time. We're avoiding touching our face. We're sheltering in place. And so we see that we can do it when the motivation is high, when there's a strong reason to change our habits, we can do it. But then we're also finding ourselves without that normal routine and, things that we're used to relying on. And those have just kind of disappeared overnight.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And from nutrition and exercise standpoint, just very basic, we've seen how that's changed as well. There's some interesting data on nutrition and how snacking has increased and alcohol has increased. From an exercise standpoint, initially often just talking to people, and maybe it's just in our circles, like, oh, I'm getting so much more activity. I'm walking all the time. But then the surveys and data shows that's not necessarily the case across the board, that we aren't all using all this free time to go out and start moving. So it's interesting seeing, like Kara said, how we've shifted overnight, essentially, but are we using that in our best interest?
Can we talk about that a little bit more? Because I found myself in the same situation. These extraordinary times called for extraordinary action. And at the very beginning, I was extremely motivated to do all of these things. And then as the weeks kind of meandered on, I found it a little bit harder mm-hmm. to keep up. It felt like, honestly, since both of you all are athletes and you understand that, it felt like I was doing a powerlifting meet every day now that we were a month into it. So how do you manage someone like that who's very motivated in the beginning, but the longer the situation goes on and the longer time we spend away from our routines, motivation is hard to keep at a high level. What do we do in that situation?
Yeah, and so I think that's real. We have to honor the fact that, we are all to some degree in the sense of quarantine fatigue right now, where we're like, oh, I thought like I was ramping up. I was prepared to like make radical change and use this free time to, Marie Kondo my lifestyle to get, totally fit, to improve my diet and start baking and cooking at home. And now I'm like, oh, it's Groundhog Day. And it feels a lot different and a lot harder. And so I think what we have to do is at first honor where we are, the fact that that is real. And then we also have to begin to look at, okay, well, let's just assume we're going to be doing this for an extended period of time. What do I need to feel my best each and every day? And instead of trying to find this radical and this extreme amount of motivation to amp up and change everything, what can I do and choose to control each and every day? What are the choices that I can make that are actionable, that will make me feel better, and that are within my power, rather than trying to, ramp up and preparing for extreme changes?
Yes, so that sounds like we're going to get into new habit forming. So before we go down that path, can you explain to everyone who's listening what exactly is a habit, and how does that influence our daily actions?
Yeah. So I think one of the things first we have to understand is that our brain wants everything to be really efficient, which is why, we do what we do. So our brain wants to automate as much as possible so that we can save and preserve our precious resources for the really important things, for difficult mental processing, for problem solving, for, the things that really count. So all of our choices that we make over and over again, our brain is always looking for patterns that it can kind of say, oh, can we put this on the fast track? How can we make it so we don't even have to think about these individual steps and just skip along as fast as possible? So when we understand that, it becomes really important to begin to look at how we choose to move through each and every day. The choices we make day after day after day, because anytime we start to repeat those, our brain is going, oh, look at this pattern. Do we need to make a super highway so we can conduct this really fast and we don't even have to think about it? So that's why I think COVID-19 in the past 10 weeks really puts us in really tricky times, is because when our routines get dismantled, we're inevitably creating new routines day in and day out. And so if it used to be that you would wake up first thing in the morning and go to the gym and work out, and now your gym is closed, you're now creating a whole new pattern that your brain's going, all right, how do we fast track this? And so if your new pattern is then to lay in bed and scroll through social media for an extra hour because now you're not working out, then your brain is going to make it much more likely that day in and day out, you choose that over and over again, which is why it can get slippery.
Yeah, I think one of the ways we talk about this with individuals is very simply, if you're walking through the woods, right? You walk through the woods the first time and no one's been there before. You have high grass. It's kind of you're trekking through to get down, create a path. Ultimately, over time, you form that new path and it becomes second nature. You have now a trail, or in your brain's mind, you have a habit because it's just second nature. Like for us, brushing your teeth, for example. Hopefully, we don't think about that morning and night. At the very least, we just do those on a daily basis. But now, what happens when it comes to nutrition, when it comes to exercise and sleep habits, we need to look at how can we work on, not go down the negative path too far as we're continuing in COVID-19, and continue some positive habits or create new ones.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Can we talk about that for a second? Because have you seen this case in your practice, and talking about someone exactly like me who uses an activity to blow off steam, just doing some martial arts practice? Now that that's gone, there's a void up here in my brain, and I need something to replace it with. And unfortunately, full disclosure, that turned into watching documentaries and kind of binge watching those things on History or Discovery. So how do you help someone replace a seemingly positive habit for another one, given these circumstances?
Yeah, so substituting in something can be challenging, especially if it's our go-to. Yeah. Brain wants to be like, well, I don't have that, so I have no choices. So to kind of just backtrack a little bit, let's understand what's involved in the habit loop, and then we can look at that through that lens in terms of creating a new habit. So anytime we have a behavior, there are 4 elements that really kind of are part of that really help to make it form into a new habit. The first is a cue. And so a cue is simply something that occurs in the environment. It could be, the time of day that you do martial arts. It could be a feeling or emotion that makes you go, you know what, I'm really feeling totally stressed right now and I need to release this steam. And so that's when you tend to go and practice. It could be a mood, like being around certain people. It could be, walking into a place that reminds you of your martial arts facility, or it could be walking into that facility itself. There are things that cue our brain to say, like, this is the choice we want to make. So those things are important, because knowing that they exist, we don't want to just leave that vacuum there. So that's step number 1. Step number 2 is a craving. And so essentially when we think of a craving, our craving is the discontent that cue creates. So that cue creates a feeling or an emotion or a sense of, I want to change my experience. Like, oh, I have this stress, I want to relieve this stress. Or, oh, I'm around my friends who I do martial arts with, I want to connect with them in that way. Or there's some degree of craving that our brain has. For a lot of people, exercise could be the craving could be that endorphin release that they get toward the end. It could be connecting with people or that feeling of relieving stress. But that occurs as well. Questions there on any of that stuff?
No, I'll have questions at the end. Let's keep going. Okay. I know we have 2 more. Yeah.
Okay. And then we have the response. That's what we choose to do. So Prentiss, for you, it's like whatever you choose to do when you get that specific cue and you have that craving. And it might have in the past been, to go and practice martial arts and relieve that stress and have that experience. But if that's gone, now your brain is unsettled. It's saying, what are we going to do in response to that? Is it possible for you to practice martial arts at home? Yes, right? It's maybe possible. I'm not sure. I'm answering for you. Sorry. But, when we think about, like, is it possible that you could do something that looks a little different? Sure. But maybe that might not satisfy exactly what you're craving. And so sometimes we just skip that step. So that response is, how do we put in something that would serve those 2 things? We have to know what the cue is. We have to know what we're craving. And then we can begin to build what would be an appropriate response. And then finally, at any habit that we have, there's a reward. There's that sense of satisfaction. Maybe you're proud of yourself for getting in that great workout. Maybe you're proud of yourself for relieving the stress. That stress is gone. For some people, the craving is gone. And so that discontent has been removed and our brain feels satisfied. But those 4 elements always exist. And so it becomes really important to become mindful and aware of what those elements look like for you, because sometimes when we don't have anything to put in, our mind will be like, oh, we can't do this. Let's just drop this entire habit. And that can become a problem when our habits are really good ones that really serve us well, right? Like exercise or getting enough sleep or, eating healthy.
Right.
Yeah. So actually, yes, now I do have a question. And you brought up a really interesting point about how not having the appropriate cue or the familiar cue at times creates like an all or nothing mentality. Like, you know what, forget it. I don't have it. I'm done with this. I'm just going to drink 6-packs, hence the spike in alcohol sales.
Right.
So what are some things that I can do and people like myself what can we do to recreate those cues and tell our brain that it's really okay? Right.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think maybe you gave the case of martial arts or anybody doing any workout, going to a gym, maybe
sure, yeah,
a home gym has something completely different, if at all. So one thing that can certainly help is maybe breaking those workouts in terms of exercise into micro workouts. So maybe let's just use the example, you used to go to the gym for an hour. Well, maybe that's not realistic at home, but maybe you could do shorter 10-minute workouts throughout the day or 20-minute workouts, just starting small to build that momentum. And even if the number looks different at the moment, overall that total number over the day will still give a similar benefit. So kind of thinking about like similar, like a when I, then I statement. And when I, in this case, the smaller workouts, when I do X, then I'll do Y. So it also allows some reward in there, as Kara talked about with habits. When I'm, in your case, martial arts, when I, let's say, wake up, then I do martial arts, or whatever it may be.
Okay.
But it kind of gives you some paired association with something. But again, it may not be exactly the same as you used to do. But if we have those smaller we chunk it down a little bit, we still get that positive feedback. That gives us some benefit, certainly. And then hopefully that continues to be a positive reward and ultimately can be a habit.
Okay, great. Thank you. So thank you for that explanation. Now let's talk about craving a little bit. And let me preface this a little. Admittedly, I'm a chocoholic. That's one of the vices that I allow myself. Now, speaking of cravings, I go in and I want to go into the pantry and get out a chocolate bar, and someone's replaced it with carob. Now, it's a terrible joke, but that's not the same. But that's definitely not the same thing in my brain, even though it's fulfilling that need of having to put something in my mouth and it has, similar taste. How do you gradually dose yourself to create the same sorts of cravings that you had before? Does that question even make sense?
It does, yeah, absolutely. And again, chocolate's an easy example because you're certainly not alone there. Right? And chocolate is not, at the end of the day, not the worst thing in the world. Maybe sitting down with a bag of chocolate chips and eating the whole thing, sure, not a great option. So in something like that, and I've talked to a lot of people about this because, again, get that question a lot. What about, we did this in our own house, to get that craving? You love chocolate, but what about like melting chocolate and dipping fruit in it, for example? So you still get that benefit, but you also get the benefit of fruit. So you don't get as much, certainly chocolate, but really what you're looking for is that little bit of flavor. Other people, and I have said, a chocolate protein shake, right, can work. Again, it's not exactly the same. It's maybe not your carob example, but it gives some of that flavor. So thinking about something, again, the dipping the fruit in chocolate for me would work really well because you're still getting the flavor. You're also getting the benefit of fruit. So it seems to be a win-win situation. Everyone needs to figure out what can work for them. And also keeping in mind the frequency that you're doing something, whether it's chocolate or alcohol or what have you. And I always say to people, what we do most of the time is more important than what we do some of the time. So figuring out the frequency as well, not beating yourself up like I downed the entire bag of chocolate chips. Am I doing that, 7 days a week? That's probably not a great idea. But figuring out that balance is important.
And I would just add to this that I also think it's really important to kind of think in really small ways. So when we talked about that response, the response, when we're trying to make a shift in behavior, a small shift in just the smallest percentage can make a difference because it's kind of alluding to what Chris said, what we do most of the time. So if most of the time we're beginning to, still have the chocolate, but we're eating less of it, or occasionally we're subbing in fresh fruit with that chocolate. Or occasionally we have carob, but we're not saying, I'm going from this great chocolate that I love to eat and indulging in it 100% to something that tastes like tree bark. And I'm not saying that about carob, but you see what I'm saying here. We don't want to go 100% in the opposite direction because we will be unsatisfied. We won't be able to sustain that. And the key with a habit is to find something that you can do and practice over and over and over again until it becomes that automatic path.
So when we create a habit, and I did read some of what you had written, you start with make it small. We want to make our brains an offer it can't refuse. So how do we go about that?
Yeah, so this idea of make it small is one that I think all of us who are in the health professions have been trying to sell to people for a long, long time. But we have culture working against us because culture is saying like, no, it's the extreme makeovers that you see, right? It's the Biggest Loser shows that have people having the greatest change in behavior and their outcomes, and that's what people are expecting. And so it's getting back to this place of the small win, of teaching people that essentially if you were forming a snowball, you would grab a little bit of snow at a time and start to pack it together. And eventually you'd be able to add more to that and more to that and more to that. And eventually you could form like a ginormous snowball. The same is true with our behaviors, that we have to think about what is the smallest win I can get under my belt. And instead of looking to like the biggest extreme, the goal is to just be able to sustain something day in and day out. So this idea of make it small is imagining any choice you're trying to make. So in the case of eating chocolate, you know, if you're going to go to carob, right? If you're going to say, I'm going to eat the carob, then you would have to say to yourself, what would make this? So if there's zero chance that I'm going to do this behavior, then I want to take that off the table. And what would make it likely that 9 times out of 10, I will absolutely choose the carob? Maybe it means that you only eat the carob once a week instead of, you know, every single day for your chocolate fix. Maybe it means that you only eat the tiniest amount of it. Or maybe it means that you have a chocolate shake or whatever, but you have to find out what's going to make you want to stick with that habit and that choice.
Okay, so can we talk about that for a second? And you brought up an attitude that's really pervasive in the fitness industry, and that is, you know, drama sells, just to be quite honest. And how have you found a way to deal with that extremism that goes on?
Yeah, you know, it has been a challenge, right? Because drama does sell, and whether it's TV or the, you know, 6 weeks transformations, whatever it may be, any of those things. And at the end of the day, it does take some convincing of individuals, but, you know, that we don't necessarily want that overnight fix, because it's not really a fix. There's nothing permanent about it. And if you've been there many, many times in the past, right, you've tried to lose weight in an example way too quick, it doesn't stick if you've had success at all. And you might for a short term, but how do we make it work for the rest of our lives, right? So we're not continuing to cycle back and forth, whether it's weight loss, weight gain with muscle gain, whatever it may be, right? Long-term solutions work. And it does, like I said, it does take some education for individuals. It does take some trust with us as practitioners and clients. But I think it does, once you can build that trust, Nick, and start to see those small wins, as Kara talked about, is when you're ultimately going to have that buy-in, because then the goal is really, from a trainer perspective, or, you know, you don't want a client for the rest of their lives if weight loss is a goal or something like that. Again, small wins are successful, and that's what we have long term.
Yeah, and it's also, just to piggyback on that, it's also the mindset. So, you know, just checking that people don't have that all or nothing mindset before you start working together is really important, or to see where they fall in that element, you know, that range. Because I think a lot of times when I would ask clients, you know, how satisfied would you be knowing what their weight loss goal might be? I'd say, how satisfied would you be with a 5-pound weight loss that you could sustain for the rest of your life? And if they'd be extremely disappointed, then that tells me that they're probably on this extreme thinking kind of path. And so I'm going to really have to spend some time kind of coming back to the idea of, let's find ways that you don't have to come back and relearn this again in a year or 2 years. You know, let's find ways to learn this lesson and move from it so we can build it as a foundation for anything you want to achieve. And that really does require some mindset work with them, because we've all been kind of taught that it's an all or nothing. I'm either working really hard towards this massive goal, or I'm doing nothing at all.
You know, one more piece to that, there's actually been some interesting data to show that, you know, over time, year after year, most people gain weight, right? It's not a ton of weight. It's not, you know, typically, but it's a few pounds. And the big issue is not that few pounds, but then it's that few pounds year after year after year. So there's actually been some data. What if we even just stop that gain, right? Which again is not what people want, but you fast forward a few years down the road, and that's a massive change, right? Just slowing that or stopping that consistent gain over time. So again, it's not the only outcome people want, but it's an easy example as what we're talking about.
So one more thing along that path. So when does this become pathological for the person? When do you know that the person who has that all or nothing extreme thinking, they're going to beat their bodies into submission, When do we as fitness professionals know they need another level of care to help them through this process?
Yeah, that's a really important and great question, and I'm glad you asked it. And I think it really just, we start to see that it's impacting a person's ability to live their life well, when it's all consuming, when the thoughts are interfering with their ability to enjoy, hanging out with their family, or when they find themselves in quarantine and in this, like the sheltering in place, and the thoughts are all consuming about how their body's shifting instead of how they're still managing to stay healthy and they're safe and they're well. Those disruptive thoughts that interfere with our quality of life and our day-to-day living, I think are times when we can refer out.
Okay, great. Yes, thank you for that. Yes, when in doubt, or if you see someone harming themselves, putting themselves in a dangerous situation, always activate your network. There are plenty of people capable of helping your clients through something like that.
100%.
Okay, so now we have a habit. We made it small. We made it easy to do every day. So what's a safe and healthy way then to make small improvements on the way to that goal?
I think, one of the things to look at, when we talk about small wins, is working with the client to define what those small wins may be, whatever their outcome goal might be down the road. Helping, because people often don't think about the small benefits they have along the way, like my pants fit a little better, or not even that, like not even body related. I have more energy. I'm sleeping better. I'm kinder to my kids or spouse or coworkers. And we know that all of those are positive side effects of taking care of yourself through exercise, through sleep, through nutrition. So I think it's helping clients find those little wins can help with that long-term success for sure.
Yeah, I think that they really have to widen the lens at which they're like accumulating information about how well they're doing. And to Chris's point, that so much of our life is how we enjoy it, how we feel during the course of the day, how much energy we have. Are we, if we're a parent, how calm and patient and loving are we toward our kids or our partner? And so those things matter, and they matter probably to a much greater extent than any outcome driven by a scale, or any outcome, that we might see in terms of a change of calories that we're eating, or the types of food that we're eating. So when we give permission to people to start to count those wins, they start to see the carryover. Because let's be honest, exercise would be the most addictive drug known to man, and also the most widely prescribed drug known to man, because it has benefits that affect every system in our bodies. So it's so powerful, and yet I think a lot of times we don't give permission to people to count the power of it and to see all the ways in which it's affecting and improving their lives. So I think that that's a really important reminder for our clients.
Absolutely.
Great. So now we're still dealing with this person who's all or nothing. If you'll allow me to use the car analogy, you want to drive from New York City to the opposite coast. All or nothing person is going to drive 3 days straight through, no matter what. But can you go back to that point? And you had mentioned this before. What are some tips, or help us to develop a habit to allow ourselves to break this down into chunks? How do we step it into checkpoints and feel okay about that? How do we stop at checkpoints, and feel okay with that?
Yeah. And so I think one is noticing, right, that we're an all or nothing person, and we're kind of trying to do all the things. We're boiling the ocean, trying to make it all happen at once. And so then it's just about permission. Can we divide that into instead of being very focused on the outcome, what are the processes that I need to do? What are the behaviors I need to do day in and day out to allow me to achieve those goals? And so if I can kind of shrink back to what will it take to achieve that, and focus on one thing. So now maybe one of the goals that I would need to do is exercise 4 days a week. Okay, so now how do I create a habit to make that happen? What's going to make it likely that I'm going to get up, or at some point during the course of the day, exercise 4 days a week? So then we go back to that cue. How can I create a cue that will remind me to do this? How can I make sure that I'm going to crave it? And one of the ways that we always encourage people to kind of crave their new behaviors is to think about how they can make it as attractive as possible. How could it be something that they really look forward to doing? And then we look at the response. How much do I need to exercise that makes it likely that I'm going to hit that 4-day-a-week goal? And then how can I reward myself along the way? So by taking it instead of this big picture, I want to change all these things. What are the specific behaviors I need to do each and every day? And then how do I support myself along that path? So for somebody, we would start with just one behavior. We would pick one thing that they need to do. And once they have that practiced and it's under their belt and they're really making that stick, then we can go on and add or change or make something else happen. But as we all know, a lot of times we start a new behavior and then we think it's fine. We're like, oh, I got this. I've done it 3 days this week or 4 days this week. It's totally fine. And we forget that life might look different next week, right? So then all of a sudden when next week we end up being on 15 Zoom calls and we don't have the time to, then it's fallen apart. So we want to give people a chance to be successful at one thing while they're working toward building that foundation.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And in your example of, the car driving across the country, what do you instead of going 3 days straight and then completely tanking, why not stop along the way and see some of the states and see some of what you see? It's, I was on the phone with a client. I was doing a webinar, a client being a corporation earlier, and they did a survey of their employees and the hundreds of thousands of employees, a massive corporation. And they said on average now people are working 15 hours a day, which is significantly more than in the past. So like Kara said, with the exercise 4 days, how can you work it into that, that 12 to 15 hours a day? If that's what's normal now, how do you make it, chunk it down so it can work? Figuring it out is super helpful.
Great. And if you don't mind, I'm going to we have a question, and this question comes from Aaron, and thank you for hopping on with us today, Aaron. And on the topic of his question is on the topic of motivation. When the individual is feeling apathy during their physical and physiological transition, what would you advise your customer? He continues, for example, bringing them back to the main reason they started the journey in the first place.
Yeah. I love this question because I just was talking about this on a live stream session earlier today. And so I always give the concept of want power. And so want power is the reason behind why you would make these choices. And so a lot of times it's back to connecting it to something that's really meaningful. So, he kind of alluded to that sense, but I always get to it by the 5 whys. So if you've ever heard of you can ask yourself 5 different whys and that'll usually get you to the root reason of anything. So if your client is, why they're feeling apathy, they're feeling like, I don't see the point, why would I do this? Then you would say, well, what do you want to change? I want to start exercising. I want to exercise more. Why? Well, because it'll give me more energy. Why does that matter? More energy will allow me to play with my kids at night or to feel better in my body. Why does that matter? Because when I feel better in my body, I'm more confident and that helps me in my job. Why does that matter? Because it really matters to me that I have purpose in life. So usually it takes us about 5 whys to get to something that is really meaningful. And if we can get our clients to that sense of connecting to something that feels like purpose, that feels strong, it can help them in that moment. And then also the reminder that even the smallest action can help to build motivation. We often think that motivation needs to show up first, but it really doesn't. It's about taking action and building that sense, that snowball and that sense of drive.
Mm-hmm.
Great. So, and on the other side of that, I have a follow-up question. And you're starting to tell that I work with a certain type of persona. When we chunk this down and we break these processes, these behaviors into manageable steps, what do you deal with the person? How do you deal with the personality who asks, is that enough? Felt like I didn't do anything. What's the deal? Why do it at all? It felt like I didn't do anything. How do you work with that persona?
Yeah, and that's pretty typical. right?
Yeah.
Again, because mentally we're seeing the overnight change, right? Magazines, TVs, whatever. So, it goes back to what we talked about earlier, is really building that trust with the person. It's not going to happen overnight. There's actually cool data you could share with people that, you add one piece of fruit, one piece of produce a day, it decreases cardiovascular risk by, and I forget the exact percentage, I think it's 50-something% over time. So you may not feel it immediately, but try to pick out, what are you noticing, right? Are you noticing that you have a little more energy? Are you noticing that whatever it may be, and trying to find, kind of like Kara talked about with the whys, trying to find those little wins that allow them to think, they are headed down the right path. It's not going to happen overnight, whatever that outcome goal is, right? But those small wins, when we can really, really narrow them down and help them define, can help them stay the course to get to the outcome they're looking for.
You can also use past experience with clients. So, if they've tried something in the past with this all or nothing approach, then I'll say, okay, how long did that last? You worked out 6 days in a row. How long did that last, being able to sustain that? And many times it'll be like 3 weeks, or, it'll be a short period of time. And so I'll say, okay, so you got 18 workouts in, but how long do you think you could commit to just doing 3 workouts a week? And, we can span that out. Like they'll be like, 6 months, 8 months, 9 months. And then we start to add up those numbers. And when you can show them the objective difference between why making a smaller choice, but being able to maintain it for a longer time, why that'll have a bigger impact at the end, that can be really powerful. I've had clients be like, oh my gosh, I could have, weeks worth of exercise more by doing it your way than doing it my old fashioned way. Mm-hmm. So it can really kind of help if they're numbers people.
Yes. One of my friends always said when we're thinking about exercise and training, and you can go hard and you can have that mentality only for so long. And if the analogy is walking up a mountain, there are 2 ways to get down, and that's just stepping off or coming back down slowly and just managing that intensity. So yes, if we break it out into small chunks, definitely more manageable and sustainable.
Yeah.
So what happens to that person? What happens to those of us who have the 15 Zoom calls a week, like I'm sure both of you do, and you miss a few workouts and you get off track? How do we manage that?
Yeah, I think first of all is not beating yourself up, right?
Sure.
We've all been there, and trying. I used the term earlier, micro workouts. Right. So not beating yourself up that I'm not hitting the gym or hitting my workout an hour each day like I used to. Could you do between your Zoom calls, whatever, 10, 15 calls a day, could you break it up, at least 5 minutes and do something? Can you do air squats? Can you do, instead of goal, can I do 100 air squats over the course of a day? Can I do 100, whatever it may be? Like set little goals like that. So you may not be hitting that big number, but even with that back-to-back meetings and calls, you're finding ways to incorporate it. I guarantee at the end of a day, the end of a week, a month, long term, if you map that out, kind of like Kara said, map that out in terms of like, how many reps did I ultimately get? If you wanted to count like that as a numbers person, they would be similar if you just spread them out throughout the day versus the one hard 1 hour workout. And I think that makes it more manageable for people. Again, set little goals like that. The 100 squats, 100 push-ups over a course of time is manageable and can work.
Yeah, and there's no point in sort of holding judgment about where we are in any given point. But we like to do that, right? We like to be like, oh, I haven't been able to make this happen. So this says something about who I am and what's possible for me. And I think when we just go back to the actions, what can I do in this moment? Then always our trajectory is moving up. It's moving in a positive direction, no matter where we are. But too often we just kind of hold judgment around, oh, this must mean this. And then we end up staying there, right? And creating that narrative or creating like some outcomes to support that narrative because that's what we believe.
Thank you for that explanation. And if you don't mind, I want to talk about that a little more. I find this very fascinating because You both work with corporations, I would imagine. I'm going to speculate that they're highly competitive people. I've been around just slightly. I've been around athletes for a great part of my life, and so there is this concept of negative reinforcement. You know, you want to get better, you want to win the championship, you're gonna run sprints, and nothing less than that is failure. If you miss training, if you in the corporate side, if you miss a meeting, if you miss the numbers, there's that aspect of failure in the back of your mind. So how do you help the person through that? Because you said it, and I try to do it myself, Chris. Don't beat yourself up. Right. And there's that other side of my brain that says, yeah, whatever that's supposed to mean, buddy. So how do you help someone through that process of not beating yourself up?
Yeah, I think a lot of times we have to start to challenge the narrative, right?
Okay.
Because the inner critic, for many people, that critical voice has allowed them to be successful. It is the driving force behind creating the success. And so it creates its own support, right? Because without it, we're fearful of that if it's not there, that somehow we won't be as successful. But I think many times we are successful despite that critical voice, right? And so it starts to, I just encourage people to challenge the narrative. Is that story one that's really serving you? And is it one that's true? You know, so what happens if you don't run the sprints? Are you still just as fast? Do you recover better and then you feel better and you can show up stronger and faster in a future workout? You know, let's begin to question what's possible, and so that we don't necessarily have to live and die by that, because that critical voice eventually also can really beat us down, right? It can make us feel like that we're not good enough and we'll never be good enough, and then that seeps out into how we interact with other people. And so it's been our experience really that when we are in these corporate settings with these people, they're finding that they don't necessarily like living in their own head anymore. You know, it's not a safe place to be. Right. And so that can be exhausting and hard.
Yeah, it's interesting to that point. One of the things that we've heard a lot, since obviously everything's now virtual and online, and you know, people aren't going to an office most of the time. They don't have a lot of that external motivation anymore, that extrinsic motivation. So now has to come intrinsically. And people have had a tough time with that, which is interesting, and trying to find that internal motivation, as Kara kind of talked about, to figure out what that is. And a lot of times it's working with trainers to help. You can kind of dig that up yourself, coming back to that why, but figuring out yourself, not beating yourself up when you don't do those sprints, or you aren't able to be as competitive as you were. But we all have that. We all have the ability, as long as we take those small steps along the way.
Okay, you brought up an interesting point. Just interesting personas of motivation. So people can be extrinsically motivated, intrinsically motivated. Are we one more than the other, or are we a mix of both? And how do we manage that and apply those two personality types to what we're going through now?
Yeah, I would say, I mean, from our experience, probably mostly a mix of both. There's going to be, like with anything, there's going to be outliers on either extremes, right? Completely extrinsic or completely intrinsic. Most people kind of fall in that bell curve. Sure. Where there's a little bit of both. I mean, ideally, we'd like a little bit more intrinsic motivation than being solely extrinsically motivated. And I think of an example of, like, I don't know, social media, for example. You're extrinsically motivated by what you see, and you see, in terms of exercise and nutrition, all these people eating perfectly, training well, looking the way you wish you looked. Unfortunately, we don't know anything about those people. What is going to get us to what is going to motivate us to reach those goals? And it may not be that external motivation may not be enough to sustain us.
And I would really say that if we're only leaning on the extrinsic, it's really not sustainable. That the more we can, because there's always intrinsic benefits to doing things if we allow ourselves to see them, right? It was kind of what we talked about. If we can just widen the lens a little bit and see all the ways in which that workout that we made the time for, that we didn't think we were going to make the time for, not only did it make us feel great, we have more energy today, but now we also have like this little boost of mental confidence and belief in ourselves. And also it means that, that we feel better and we're sleeping better tonight. Like if we can start to teach people all the ways those dots connect, then they've got their own big picture that they're looking at. And it's not just this one little data point that they're like, I'm waiting for that. And if it doesn't happen, well, then I might as well stop. Right? So we can give them lots of ways to paint that picture.
So let me ask you this question. I'll give you a little case, just a general case, nothing really specific, but how do you use those 5 whys that you talked about earlier to shift someone who's predominantly extrinsic? How do you move that, how do you shift them over a little bit to be more intrinsically motivated?
Yeah. So, it really does boil down to knowing their want power. So keep on asking the whys until why they really want to do that. And I will tell you that one time in the past, I had a client who had significant amounts of weight to lose, had never really exercised. And, weight loss was her goal. And so when I asked her, she was like, I need to stop eating the junk food. And I was like, okay, well, why? And she said, well, I need to lose this weight. Why? And she was like, because I need to take the weight off and have more energy. Well, why is that important? And so she gets to, well, because I want to be more active and my kids are all expecting and I want to be able to play with my grandkids. And I was like, why does that matter? And she's like, because I want to get down on the floor and be able to pick them up. And I was like, and why does that matter? And so she finally ultimately came to this place of she wanted to be able to be an active, vibrant part of their life. And so now all of a sudden, this was something that was money. It was pure gold, right? So we get to that meaningful why. And then you begin to say, okay, so when we make this choice, we've got to connect it to this why, right? And so the outcome is usually the extrinsic motivation. And so many people think like the goal is going to be, the real money is going to be losing the weight. And once I get that and I look great in my body, then that's going to be all the extrinsic motivation I need. But once they start to see that it's really about something deeper and more meaningful to them, then they can also begin to identify the ways in which they might notice they have more energy, or she can be this vibrant, active part of her grandkids' lives, even if she's not at this place, this goal weight yet, by holding the babies or helping her daughters, whatever it might be. So I think that we start to see all these different ways in which that bigger why shows up, and having them reflect on that every day can be really powerful.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that explanation. Now, just one more follow-up question, because right now we're coming up to the end of the hour. You've taken us through everything that goes into just one habit. At the end, I want to know, what's the threshold to start adding extra habits, new habits? But before we do that, so just to boil that down, help me understand this, you sent me some interesting reading material. I read BJ Fogg, and so when we're extrinsically motivated, it's usually attached to a time or an amount of something, but we really want to also get to those places of feeling autonomous, being able to do things by ourselves, having mastery, whatever that means to the person over the skill, or just belonging, to having the ability to belong to a group. Can you tie that together for us, for those of us who are listening?
So, because I think this idea of just knowing who we are and why we're making the choices that we're making can be really powerful. And, for many times we make these choices in our lives because we think it's going to get us something, or we're going to become different people, right? But when we can begin to own why we're choosing what we're doing, when we can be mindful of the choices that we're making, when we can begin to make those choices because we're investing in ourselves, well, then there's real power there. And this idea of just understanding that the choices we make day in and day out are truly ours. We own those. And we get to shape who we're going to become, what we achieve, and who we get to be by the choices we make daily. That is really kind of what we're talking about here, right? That the power of, if I want to be the type of person who's more kind and loving, then what are the actions I can do to be more kind and loving in just small ways? And then I can start to prove to myself I'm that person. When I want to be somebody who is more fit and who works out, what are the ways I can move toward that identity so I own it? It's not something I'm doing because eventually I hope to be there, but I'm becoming it by the choices I make daily.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. So now, like I said, we've gotten through one habit. What's that threshold? How do we know when we can start layering on different practices?
So I think it comes down to when you start to not have to think about whatever it is you're doing, okay. Right? Don't make that conscious effort like I am now eating one piece of fruit today, whatever it may be. Again, I'd use the example of brushing your teeth as an easy one. You don't think about that. It's just part of the daily ritual. So you want whatever it is you're doing to become that kind of down that carved path where it's not even taking a second thought, that it's part of your daily ritual. Then say, okay, now that this is part of that, I can now add in X, Y, or Z. Again, and there's no time frame. We've heard you have 21 days to make a habit, which isn't necessarily the case. Bigger things take longer, whatever it may be. So it's not an answer like in 3 weeks you will be able to do X, and then you add Y. Everyone is different, and every depending on what you're working towards, that length of time could be different as well.
I also want people to give themselves permission to back off. If they add something else on and it feels like too much or things start to fall apart, okay, well then that's too much too fast. And let me go back. Yeah, let me practice at this. If we give our clients permission to practice new habits and new behaviors rather than feeling like they have to adopt them and they have to adopt them overnight and in such extreme way, then we've given them the power to keep on shaping and learning and becoming who they want to be in a way that fits their lifestyle and what works for them. And that's truly empowerment, right? And that's the goal.
Okay, well, thank you for that explanation. And we are coming up to the end of the hour. Thank you very much, Chris and Kara, for sharing with us the skill of building habits. I don't think I learned a lot today, and definitely, certainly since you gave me my homework assignments. I'm going to allow both of you to finish up with your closing points. Just tell us the most important points that you'd want our listeners to get from today's webinar. And during that time, I'm going to wait to see if anyone else has questions. So, Chris, what's the big takeaway for today?
Yeah, absolutely. And first of all, thank you for hosting this. And of course, thanks to everyone for watching. What I'd like to say, I guess I would end with is remembering that one, like Kara kept saying, giving yourself permission to do whatever it is you want to work on. Start small. Okay, start small. Know that any kind of change is going to take time. Whatever that outcome goal is, remember what processes along the way to get to that goal, and celebrate those small wins. Don't overlook those. Every little bit of positive change is a win. Celebrate those. Write them down. High five, virtual high five, whatever it may be. But those are all the things that's going to allow us to be successful in the long run.
Okay, great. Thank you. And if people wanted to communicate with you after this, how could they do that?
So our website is Mohr Results. Our last name
Results.
is HRResults.com. Certainly on social media. On Facebook, it's Mohr Results. On Instagram, it's Mohr Results. Check in. You can certainly send us messages there. We're on there regularly, chatting, putting videos like this and others. So definitely check those sites out.
Okay, thank you very much for joining us today, Chris. And Kara, what's the last word?
Yeah, so I guess if I could have two questions that I'd have people keep in the back of their mind, it would be what if and how can I? And so if we gave ourselves permission to just ask those two questions, like what if I could make this change? Because so often we align to something that we think that it has to look like. We think that exercise has to look like this. We think eating has to look like this. We look to other people for the answers. But if we give ourselves the chance to ask ourselves our own questions, then we can come up with our own answer intrinsically and find what works for us. And that's where the real power lies.
Thank you very much for that, Kara. And thanks again, Chris and Kara, for joining us today. And thank you, everyone, who took time out of their busy days to join us as well. I hope all of you have a great afternoon and continue to be safe.
Thank you.